Hello, I'm Marilyn Moore, and this is part 2 of my interview with George H. Smith discussing the writing of his first book, Atheism, The Case Against God. In the first part of our interview, George talked about his childhood faith. He reflected on some of the more troubling aspects of his faith, which made him guilty, judgmental, and overly introspective. All this made me wonder, what was the transition like from a pious childhood to atheism? Was there a betrayal, an awakening, a dark night of the soul? As it turns out, it was a chance encounter. One day after school, the most annoying guy in George's high school band hassled George about Jesus. It's a quintessentially George story that you won't want to miss. George also talks about his introduction to free thought literature and philosophy, highlighting some of the writers and books that contributed to his development. He then identifies the single most influential book in his transition from Christian to atheism. All right, George, so how do you go from being a pious, religious child to writing Atheism, The Case Against God at 23? Are there some areas as a teenager, some point that you start to change?
Well, definitely. I've thought a lot about this. I even wrote about it in an essay I published in my second book, Atheism, Ayn Rand, and Other Heresies. I published a fairly brisk account of my transition in My Path to Atheism, a title I stole from the 19th century free thought feminist Annie Besant. She also wrote a piece called My Path to Atheism. I think in terms of where I lived, it's hard for me to remember how old I was, but I do remember when you're in the military and you're a kid and you keep moving every 3 years from base to base, from state to state. Those are marked transition points. What I do know is I was religious and going to church when I lived in Washington State. I moved to Tucson kind of early in the 7th grade, went to Aliceville Junior High School. And I still considered myself a Christian, but for some reason, I just sort of went through a period where religion didn't interest me a whole lot. I think I said in that essay, My Path to Atheism, that maybe it was those seductive Arizona mornings that allured a boy to play, but I just went through a period that I didn't think about it, I didn't go to church, etc. I tucked my Bible somewhere in my closet, wasn't even sure where it was. When I was very interested in music. I played the saxophone at the time, later got into other woodwinds. And I believe it was in the beginning of my sophomore year, which I was born in 49, so that would make me, 15? Again, I hadn't thought about religion a lot at that point. I was approached by a fellow musician in the Rincon High School band, a guy that nobody liked. He was very obnoxious. So you can imagine how obnoxious he was after he found Jesus. He'd become an evangelical Christian. And he came up to me while I was packing up my saxophone one day and asked me if I'd found Christ. Now, I had grown up. There's nothing more annoying when you grow up in a religious environment and you've done all that shtick yourself, and then some guy comes out, oh, have you found Christ? And I made some sarcastic remark, why, did you lose him? Something like that, some stupid response. I just wasn't in the mood to be preached to, of all people, by this obnoxious guy. And we started to get into an argument, and it continued at a place between, I only lived a few blocks from Rincon and Tucson, a place called the Lucky Wishbone, which was sort of a fast food burger place. And we sat and ate cheeseburgers and fries and drank Coke, and he went on, and for some reason, I just probably to annoy him, I found myself playing devil's advocate. And I'd say, well, how do you know God even exists? Now, to my knowledge, that's the first time I openly questioned it. But I don't think that I would have just come out like that unless I had thought about it on some level. I just don't remember. It probably was subconscious. I was starting to question things. In fact, I know it was. There were some incidents that definitely occurred that started me questioning. We can talk about those another time if you want. Anyway, then he gets all huffy and he says to me that all great thinkers have believed in God. Now, that's, first of all, he hadn't read anything, so how would he even know if that were true? Well, it turns out that my parents sometime before had bought the family a set of the great books of the Western world, that huge set, kind of a decent set. So I went home and looked through the kind of this vast index, this 2-volume index that they have. And I looked under Freud and found some statements. Freud was an atheist, where he said that belief in God was sort of a remnant of an infantile father longing. And I remember I wrote out some of these quotations. So a few days later, we had lunch again, and I lured him into a confrontation, and I had him repeat his statement that all great thinkers have believed in God. At this point, he was kind of suspicious. He kind of knew I was up to something. And I had my folded up paper with the quotations, Freud quotations. And then I asked him, I said, yeah, I think that all great thinkers. I said, well, was Sigmund Freud a great thinker? And of course, we didn't really know anything about Freud, but we knew the name. So he said, no, I guess so. So I started reading these passages from Freud. And I don't remember how the argument ended, except that I just wouldn't let him off the hook. I started badgering him with questions about problems with his father, and did he believe in God because he had problems at home. And I just was relentless. I just didn't like being pressured like this by this guy. Well, okay, it was sort of a silly incident by a high school kid, but that actually got me interested in actually reading stuff. I went through, I didn't read through the great books, but I sort of went through them looking for different things in philosophy. But frankly, they were a bit above, most of the stuff was a bit above my knowledge level at the time. I ended up going to a local library in Tucson, a branch library, and I ran across two things that I got at the same time. One was Robert Ingersoll's Mistakes of Moses, which is a pamphlet, I guess you'd call it, but they had bound it in a library binding. I don't think it was over 40 or 50 pages at the most. The other, which had a huge influence on me, was Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, in the so-called first two parts. Took him home, and I don't remember much about my response to Ingersoll, except I thought his language was a bit flowery, and it is. He was an orator in the 19th century, and orators in the 19th century, they don't necessarily read all that well today. But Paine really struck me, because I knew about Paine, and I was interested in history, but no one had ever mentioned to me that he wrote this scathing indictment of Christianity. I mean, the Age of Reason, you know, people think of Thomas Paine, you know, these are the times that try men's souls, and wrote Common Sense, and one of the great spark plugs of the American Revolution. And he wrote this just, and I mean it's scathing, he just attacks Christianity all out. It's just a remarkable attack. And it wasn't so much that he had written it, it was that no one of my teachers had ever bothered to mention, when they mentioned Thomas Paine, that, you know, by the way, the guy, you know, really hated Christianity. This wasn't just a sort of philosophical analysis. He went to, like the deists before him, he didn't really do much original, but it's clear he drew on earlier deists. He went into Bible contradictions, unfulfilled prophecies, Bible immoralities, and he has these very hopped up polemical passages about how could anything but a cruel fiend, this isn't in his language, but you know, only a cruel fiend could possibly do this. And it was a typical, I learned later, a typical deistic attack on the Bible. And he was in that tradition. He was an Englishman, and he didn't come over to America until just a year or two before the Revolution. And it was clear that while in England he read and was familiar with a lot of the deistic writings, because this is very much in that. In fact, it's sort of as it started to decline. He's sort of a latecomer among the deists. He later wrote so-called Part 3 of Age of Reason, which is an attack on biblical prophecies. It's obviously borrowed on another book that Anthony Collins, the man I mentioned earlier, he wrote an attack on biblical prophecies. Now, people may think that's silly, but you have to understand that Christians were attempting to prove the Bible, as fundamentalists do now, by saying, well, look, these prophecies have been fulfilled. Well, that's hogwash. I mean, you're taking something that's written hundreds of years before and then sort of adjusting the facts to present day to say that, you know, it was somehow fulfilled. But and the deists went after that. Anyway, Paine had a remarkable influence on me. I should also mention that part of Age of Reason was an attack on the atheism of the French Revolution. The deists were also, they were sort of in the middle. They opposed atheism and they opposed revealed religion. They championed, as I said earlier, what they called natural religion. Religion revealed through our natural faculties, our senses, our reason. They contrasted natural revelation, they called it, they used that term, natural revelation, with special revelation. Again, revelation is only given to a secret group over here. And they just thought that was absurd, that God would do that. So the deists, in fact, were kind of what you might call practical atheists. That is, God didn't enter into any of their day-to-day practical activities because God doesn't communicate to people. If a guy came along and says, you know, I had an inspiration from God last night, they would just dismiss him and say, no, God doesn't talk to people individually. What humans need to know, we can all discover through the use of our common reason. So you'll find, Thomas Jefferson is an example. This modern controversy, I've got some religious historian, I remember his name, oh, he was really a Christian. Well, these labels were very loose back then. Jefferson called himself a Unitarian. He was an admirer of the English Unitarian Joseph Priestley, the guy credited with discovering oxygen. Well, a lot of Priestley's writings, which Jefferson praised Priestley for, were attacking biblical infallibility. He was going after the Bible. And Jefferson ends up with this so-called Jefferson's Bible, where he does his own version of the Gospels with all the miracles cut out. And it's basically just the moral teachings of Jesus. And that goes, I know I'm digressing here, but this is an important point about deism. There's two sides. Historians generally refer to two sides of deism. One is called critical deism. That's the part I've been discussing, the criticisms of the Bible, which were very extensive. The other is called constructive deism. This was the positive teachings of the deists. And this goes back at least to the 17th century. The idea that the deists had was all the great religions had core moral teachings that were essentially the same. And that through corruption, and they often talked about the corruption of Christianity, through the early Catholic Church and going up through the Protestants, that a bunch of people had gotten into power, had corrupted, in the case of Christianity, the teachings of Jesus. And that what we needed to do was recapture the original spirit of Christianity and of Islam and of Judaism, and take away all these human corruptions that had accumulated through various self-interested actions of what they'd call priests, or well, they didn't call them priests, but papists, and they thought that they often attacked organized religion, and the institutionalizing of religion. They didn't really believe in churches per se or anything like that. Anyway, Paine had a huge influence on me, and it made me call myself a deist. The deists relied mainly on the design argument of the existence of God. The design argument was by far the most convincing argument, and it lasted far beyond things like the first cause argument and other arguments. It lasted at least until Darwin popularized the idea of evolution, because it was very difficult prior to that theory to understand how life could have, something so complex as life could have originated spontaneously. They just had no theoretical framework to explain it. So Paine relies, like many deists, on the design argument, as did Jefferson and many others. I thought it was a plausible argument. But it's sort of a slippery slope. Once I started reading Paine, before I read any more free thought literature, there was a gospel supply store just about a block from where I lived, and I saved my pennies and bought all kinds of stuff. Very odd for a sophomore in high school. The first book I bought was the Abington Bible Commentary. I still have a copy of it. It's about this thick. An early 20th century Bible commentary, kind of a liberal one. I started buying Bible dictionaries, concordances, all kinds of stuff. So my introduction, because once I read Paine, I thought, well, I really need to go study the Bible. I remember searching through my closet, finding my Bible. But I made the mistake from a Christian point of view, starting at the beginning. Because when you read the Bible, it's just stuff when you're younger you're not supposed to read. And I don't think, during all those years of reading the Bible, I know it's mainly probably the Gospels and the Gospel of John in particular. But I started reading all these laws and ceremonial restrictions and punishments in Leviticus and all the atrocities, and some of them were just astonishing. Just killing everybody in the city, man, woman, and child, except the virgins, leave them alive for your soldiers. Well, okay, we were talking about primitive armies, but the idea that God would actually command this, it just struck me as I was horrified. And I've often said that it was probably the Bible, as much as anything else, that dissuaded me from Christianity. And it did. And then by the way, many atheists will tell you that. They said when they ever sat down and read the Bible, but not just the parts the preachers tell you to read, the whole thing. I read it from cover to cover. It took me quite a while, but I did do it. And the other thing was, reading these, like the Abington Bible Commentary, has for the time, some very good historical surveys of how the Bible, the New Testament, for example, came to be canonized. Why were certain books accepted, certain books weren't? Well, that takes a lot of the mystique off the Bible. It just didn't somehow land on planet Earth. You have debates, you have many theologians at the time rejecting Revelation, for example. Most of the churches rejected, some accepted it. Why were certain books accepted? It was a vote. Votes were taken. The Council of Nicaea, I think, was one of the My church history is a little rusty, but that name rings a bell. I think it was in 325. So basically you have a bunch of Catholic theologians voting which books should be accepted as divinely inspired, and which books shouldn't. And if you ever watch even on the History Channel, they'll talk about the lost books of the Bible and these Gospels that didn't make it in, and so on and so forth. So anyway, that got me away from Christianity, and then I started reading more hardcore free thought, you might say.
Okay.
And to tell you the truth, I can't remember the first atheist I ever read. I know I was reading some Bertrand Russell, and he was probably one of the first philosophers I ever read. I also read some Walter Kaufmann, two books I still have a high regard for. He was, I believe, a philosopher at Princeton. Did a lot of Nietzsche translations, translated Hegel. Kaufmann wrote two books. One was called The Faith of a Heretic, which is probably the first complete philosophy book I read. And the other was called Critique of Religion and Philosophy. And I can't tell you, I know Kaufmann, I don't know if he called himself an atheist. I believe Russell called himself an agnostic. But it was probably through Bertrand Russell and Walter Kaufmann that I started getting more of a philosophical slant. And at some point, I just decided that I didn't believe in God. It just, the God of deism made no more sense to me than the God of Christianity. And I have to say that that's an easy transition. When you give up the God of Christianity and become a deist, you lose a kind of a personal friend, so to speak. You lose a personal force in your life. But once that God becomes this abstract, remote being that doesn't interfere in human affairs, and you give up belief in the God of deism, then the transition to atheism, it's like, who cares? I mean, he doesn't, pardon my language, give a shit anyway. So even if I'm wrong, I've got nothing to fear. You know? Sorry for the long rambling answer, but
No, that's quite all right, George.